Stop the presses because the coveted Rob Schneider endorsement is in. That's right, the Deuce Bigalow, male gigolo star, has weighed in is endorsing Robert F. Kennedy Jr. for president. The actor tweeted, inspiring, hopeful, courageous, most importantly, like his father, compassionate. It's my honor to support RFK Jr.
Here's a recent interview between Jimmy Dore and Schneider where they spoke on the controversial Joe Rogan interview with RFK Jr. and his calls for Dr. Peter Hotez to debate Kennedy on the issue of vaccines. Let's watch.
Well, as you know, what just happened with Joe Rogan and Hotez, beautiful, wasn't that? Because I've known about him as a stooge, a pharma stooge, along with Offit. These guys were evil pharma stooges that called for the arrest of people and bring in the Justice Department. But finally being exposed for the charlatan that he is, Hotez. And that is really, I mean, when you're a respected person who also has a ton of respect for you, Glenn Greenwald, when he tweets about it, when he says, well, this, you have to go well, he is the most respected journalist of the last 10 years, at least. Who can compare with him? Yeah. And I really have a ton of respect for him.
Anderson Cooper's up there? Don Lemon?
Him in the water with a guy. That's beautiful. That just says everything, doesn't it? And there are cameras everywhere now, but the internet lasts forever. So seeing...
So obviously there's two comedians yucking it up. Those views aren't necessarily our own. But it is a reflection, I think, of the way that RFK Jr. is exciting a lot of people who haven't necessarily weighed in publicly into politics before. I see a lot of comments under our videos about him and the videos elsewhere on the internet of people saying, I am a lifelong Republican, but I'm considering switching my registration to be able to vote for RFK Jr. What do you make of this?
And isn't there's a world where switching Republicans back to Democrats would be something the DNC is interested in doing or would think is a good project? You know, with some of those Obama voters who voted for Trump, who came into the coalition because of Trump, but maybe are not all that enthusiastic about Trump's economic policies. You always talk about how it's faux working class populism. It's culturally maybe a bit more inclined with what they want, but is not actually offering them the tangible economic issues. You'd think a Democratic Party wants to win some of those people back. You'd think that, but I'm not sure they do. Why would they want deplorables voting for them? Isn't that the Democratic Party's view, is that if these are bad people, they should be voting for Republicans?
Yeah, well, we already know that they don't really care about either winning or attracting that cohort back because, I'm sorry to always have to say this, but the best performing candidate with independents in 2016 and 2020 was Bernard No Middle Name Sanders.
Does he not have a middle name?
He does not have a middle name.
That's
Suspicious.
Great. That's great. Middle names are pointless. Fewer people should have them.
I feel very strongly the opposite. I think it's the most sus thing about Bernie Sanders is that he doesn't have a middle name. What were your parents doing? No, they had other priorities, I'm sure. But I do, the Democratic Party obviously cares more about picking its own winners to advance the agenda of the party more than it does actually winning elections, because also we saw in matchup after matchup that Bernie Sanders was going to do better against Donald Trump, but that wasn't as important as it being her turn.
We've got another clip we want to play. Meanwhile, commentator Bill Maher sat down with RFK Jr., where he commended his, quote, brave stance on COVID vaccines, actually. Let's watch.
I also got to say, and I'm kind of stealing my thunder from a friend of mine who you would know, but I'm not going to mention, who really said this, but I totally agree with it. Whether you're right or wrong, I think you're mostly right about this issue, especially the vaccine issue. The guts and the integrity to take that stand and stick and buy your guns when media, you lose the New York Times, family, that to me is a pair of balls.
Yeah, I think sort of establishment people just have not reckoned with how harmful their certainty on certain COVID subjects, the trust the science crowd, the Dr. Peter Hotez's, who have been all over the place. We found, when it was Trump in charge still, he was hesitant about, don't trust the Trump vaccine. He was one of those people. And then when you have to take a vaccine or you're killing everyone became part of the establishment personality, he pivoted to that. He attacked Jon Stewart for joking about the possibility of a lab leak. Anyway, that kind of person has lost so much credibility with the American people that some people who would not have been amenable to RFK Jr. because of his views on other vaccines, his longstanding views on vaccines, are listening for the first time because the establishment voices have discredited themselves with no recognition of that. If there was more recognition, maybe you wouldn't, because I don't think, we've been trying to parse exactly. He said, RFK Jr. said a number of different things about vaccines over the years. Sounds like there might be something to the vaccines that did have mercury at the time, but they don't have that anymore. So I don't.
Point. Yeah.
And I unlike maybe what RFK Jr. again, I don't know exactly what he said. Looks to me like even the COVID vaccines were doing something to help you if you're in a risk category or if you're very old. You'd rather
or generally speaking, prevented, brought down rates of hospitalization and death.
But the over-promising of the establishment scientific crowd has really hurt them.
Yes. I mean, I'm a little surprised by Bill Maher's take, to be honest, because he has this kind of anti-establishment brand, but has very much been someone who was taken in by a lot of the Russiagate stuff. He admitted later that he was wrong on that, but he has been someone who's very much of a scold, like, don't you know what the science is? I'm going to lean into credentialists and elitism, and he had the movie Idiocracy, where he just condemned people who hadn't read enough books and who were very stupid. That sort of sorry, he wasn't Idiocracy, but that's the sort of thing he has. His was the religiosity,
anti-religion.
Yeah, but. This does feel like a little bit of a heel turn for him. I guess it's welcome if he's going to do it, but it does feel a little bit like jumping on the bandwagon, jumping on where the energy is in the space in a way that I don't necessarily fully trust. But I do think it's really good that RFK Jr. is doing all of these long-form interviews. I think that so many politicians are afraid of what it means to be pressed and not being able to use a 7-minute escape hatch of cable news to get out of a tough question. But what I see again over and over again to people responding to RFK Jr.'s interviews, what they say is, I'm so glad he had the time to talk this through, and I really appreciate that he admits that when he doesn't know the answer to a question, he is going to look into it further. And I really appreciate his willingness to say that I might actually change my mind on this going forward. And I don't know, I do think that politicians are afraid. It's like they're in an interview where a wrong answer will disqualify you. When it's not quite like that, you have the opportunity when you're running for president to get way more than one hearing that you would get in an interview context, in a job interview context. And people really appreciate your willingness to learn and grow over the course of that process.
So he did there's a long profile of him in The Atlantic. He's interviewed in it throughout. He talks about how he feels he's been misrepresented by mainstream people, and the author of The Atlantic piece says, are you worried I'm going to misrepresent what you're saying? And he says basically yes. Not that he says, I think you're going to get my quotes accurate and everything. I think you're going to find some way to contextualize it where it's not quite what I mean or it's not accurate. And then so the Atlantic guy says, well, why are you bothering to talk to me? And he says, I'll talk to anybody. That is a real asset that for a political figure to talk to people, even to talk to people who are opposed to you, because then if they do overreach, if they do a bad job, then you end up looking good among the people who already support you. This is something that some people on the right don't understand. I mean, you see people like Vivek Ramaswamy, I think will go on maybe it's mostly friendly. I don't know if he'll go on opposition stuff too, but maybe he...
Well, yes. It was his exchange with Don Lemon that...
Right, that's right.
Preceded Don Lemon's firing.
Exactly. So, but DeSantis, and I don't think this is good for him, has been he'll do oppositional kind of appearances for Florida media or mainstream Florida channels, but has been not so keen to wade into the arena nationally with people he doesn't like, and I think it's holding him back. Yeah.
So DeSantis is tough because while I do think, generally speaking, it's good advice to do the interview, Ro Khanna is one of these. He's pretty much the only progressive elected who will submit to being interviewed by independent progressive media personalities. Often those interviews are very contentious. Often my interviews with him are very contentious, but he keeps coming back.
He's a glutton for punishment. I have been astonished his willingness to be interviewed by you. You hold him to quite. Never mind. Maybe your audience knows, or maybe the audience knows you respect him.
My audience says, I appreciate that at least he's willing to do this when nobody else is. And so broadly speaking,
he's literally the only one.
I think that's you get a lot of credit for that. Ron DeSantis does not always come across well. I do think the caveat to being benefited by doing all of these interviews and submitting yourself even to hostile inquiry is coming across as authentic, sincere, and good-natured. And it's not entirely clear to me that Ron DeSantis has the capacity to do that. Now, it could just be a lack of media training and exposure, and then if he did it more, he would come off better. But remember that his Twitter Spaces was largely considered to be less than ideal, shall we say, not just because of the technological issues or what have you, but that he chose to read a stump speech off of a piece of paper. He seemed stiff and wooden. There was no sense of collegiality or openness. And if you contrast that to RFK Jr.'s Twitter Spaces and other kinds of appearances, there's something that feels very warm and organic about it. The guy seems likable regardless of whether or not you agree with his opinions. And that's not something that can be taught. You don't have to, it's not just likability, it's authenticity. So I wouldn't say that Bernie necessarily seems likable, but there was something that just seemed frank and honest and authentic about him to people, and that can also carry the day. But do we think that Ron DeSantis and the positions that he's staking out is frank and honest and authentic? Do you think that he wakes up in the morning passionate about wokeism, or he sees that's a political lane for him to ride to success? I think RFK Jr. is genuinely passionate about vaccine skepticism, the environment, lifting, whatever it is, whatever you think about it, and that makes a big difference. Absolutely. Authenticity is certainly key. I mean, it is key for likability because people don't like people who don't seem inauthentic. So absolutely. All right, we'll have more Rising right after this.